Up until now, we've only been using one form of selection inside of Illustrator, but in this movie, we want to expand on that a bit and start to explore a new tool called the Direct Selection tool. So we've been working with the regular selection tool all this time. It's the black arrow that we've been using to click on stuff and to drag things around the canvas and stuff like that. But now let's grab this tool right next to it, the Direct Selection tool, which you can do by clicking on it or simply pressing the letter A on your keyboard. You'll know that you have the Direct Selection tool selected because it is white as opposed to black. So it's got a little white arrow tip on it as opposed to a black arrow tip. You will also notice that when you make a selection with the Direct Selection tool, so if I were to click anywhere on this path right here, that all of the anchor points of that path actually start to show up. So this is a closed shape as we discussed earlier. So I've got anchor points here, 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 and here. You'll notice as I hover over them with the Direct Selection tool, the anchor points sort of grow in appearance, indicating where they are so that it's easier for me to select them when and if I want to start manipulating them. So why would I want to use the Direct Selection tool? Well, if you do a lot of hand drawing inside of Illustrator, or if you prefer to create shapes without holding down the Shift key, things like that, you might have to manipulate the anchor points after you've drawn something in order to get the final look that you're going for. I like to put it that we want to get about 95% of the way there with our initial drawing in Illustrator, and then we use tools like the Pen tool and the Direct Selection tool to go that last 5%. So for this circle right here, for instance, I could select one of these anchor points. And when I select one of those anchor points by clicking on it, you'll notice that several of the control handles become active as well. These are all of the control handles that are connected to the two paths that run through this anchor point. So the control handle here runs from here to here, the control handle here, and the path runs from here to here. So I have the ability to control the appearance of both sides of the top of this circle. You can also select multiple anchor points at a time. So I could actually hold down the Shift key and click this anchor point. You can see now that I get even more anchor points illuminated down here. I can hold down the Shift key and click this one, hold down the Shift key and click this one. As I start to select all of them, the anchor points are going to remain highlighted, but the control handles are going to go away because there's no way for me to simultaneously manipulate all of the control handles at once. So in this case, let's click away and let's click back on this top one here. And let's take a look at how these control handles actually work. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to take this control handle. You'll notice when you get next to it, it'll actually say handle. Just click on that and drag it in just a little bit. You'll notice as you drag it in that the bottom part actually starts to bow out because this is all connected. So as this dips in, that bulges out. That's because the control handle, and you can see it when I click right here on this anchor point, the control handle is pretty much linked with itself. So as I rotate it around, the other side just sort of rotates accordingly, like so. Now, if and when you need to change anything you've done, you can just press Command or Control Z on the keyboard to get it back to normal. You can also manipulate different sides of a control handle independently of the other side, but you have to use a modifier key in order to do that. So let's say that I just wanted to make this part sort of curve inward and I don't want this bottom part to bulge out. What I'm going to do is just hold down the Option key on the Mac, the Alt key on the PC, and click and drag in. You'll notice as I do that, the other handle appears, but it is not changing in appearance whatsoever. I've broken the link between them. So now they operate completely independent of one another. I could do the same thing for the other anchor point. So if I click here and manipulate this one, holding down the Option or Alt key, actually you don't even have to hold down the Option or Alt key once it's broken. So that is allowing me to swing that in and out anytime I want. I could take this one up here at the top and start to do the same thing, but you notice it also is linked. So in this case, what I'll do is undo that with Command or Control Z, and then let's hold down that Option or Alt key, and let's kind of curve it inward like so. So you can see I'm changing the shape of this circle completely just by manipulating these little anchor points. You can also select anchor points and move them around. So if I click this anchor point, for instance, I can reposition it anywhere I want on the artboard. And when I let go, everything just follows along with it. I can also take this one. Let's move it down just a little bit. And you'll notice sometimes you make a mistake, kind of folds things in on each other. Just hit Command or Control Z if that happens to you. There you go. You'll also notice as I approach the outer portion of a path while I have an anchor point selected, I get that same sort of curved segment look that I had when I was working with the pen tool earlier when we were manipulating shapes. It works just the same way. Click and drag, and you can manipulate these and add curved segments to pretty much anything you want, just like so. Now, again, if you wanted to get back to your original, you just hit Command or Control Z until you get back to your original circle. So, the direct selection tool is definitely a tool that I use on a regular basis. It's one that really gives you that granular level of control where you can get in and you can dial in every little teeny tiny aspect of your design. So if you've got paths that don't really fit with one another, if you've got a curve that you need to refine or a straight line you need to straighten up, these are all of the little tools that you need to use to do that. Anchor points, control handles, and the direct selection tool. That's how you get the most control over your artwork. In this movie, we're going to talk about grouping objects together inside of Illustrator. So let's say, for instance, that you have several different independent objects on your screen, and really and truly you'd like for them to move and act as a group all together. That's actually pretty easy to do, but first you have to know how to make the proper selection. So the easiest way to make a selection, of course, is just to select an object with the selection tool and then hold down Shift to get any other object that you want selected like that. However, you can use other means of selection as well. So for instance, let's say that I wanted all of the interior pieces here selected. I could go over here and grab something called the lasso tool and then just come out and make an outline around all of these, which takes a little bit of time, but it's not too difficult. You just outline all of these, making sure you get all of them inside of your selection. And once you have all of those selected, they will be able to be grouped together. So I'll just draw a selection around all of these, and there we go. So now all of those are selected. I'll switch to my selection tool, and I'll go up to the object menu, and I'll choose Group. Once I've selected Group, they are now one solid object. If I click away from them and then click back on, you'll see that all of them get selected, as opposed to the ones surrounding them, which are still very much independent objects. So now let's select the second level here. This time I'll use the old Shift-click method to make sure that I get them all. So let's just grab every single one of these. And then this time, let's go back up to the object menu, choose Group again. That's going to group all those together. Finally, let's select all the ones around the outside, and we'll just use the Shift-click method for this as well. And once we have all of those selected, I want you to use the keyboard shortcut for grouping because this is extremely useful. Go ahead and hold down the Command key on the Mac, the Control key on the PC, and press the letter G on your keyboard. Once you do that, all of those objects are now grouped together. So you can see we have a group on the outside, a group in the middle, and a group on the inside, all of which have been grouped by us very simply. And then if you wanted this whole thing to act as a group altogether, you can select everything by going to Select All, or by pressing Command A on the Mac, Control A on the PC, and then Command or Control G to group it. This enables you to have everything in one single group. Now, if you wanted to ungroup these objects, it's actually pretty easy to do. Just go to the Object menu and choose Ungroup. You could also select a group. So in this case, all of our three groups are now still grouped within each other, but not overall. So let's select this small group in the middle here. And let's ungroup it. The easiest way to ungroup it is to hold down the Shift key, the Command or Control key, and press the letter G. That's going to ungroup them and allow these to be independent objects once again. So let's do the same thing for this one. Shift Command G or Shift Control G on the PC. And the last one, let's just do it by the menu, Object, Ungroup. So now we've gone through, everything has been grouped, and now ungrouped. So the next time you have a bunch of artwork that you think you need to move in unison or make universal changes to, try grouping your objects for a more expedited workflow. All right, let's talk about how to duplicate objects inside of Adobe Illustrator, because this is something that you have to do quite often if you're, making something that shows movement or you need to create patterns and things like that. So being able to duplicate objects very quickly is something that a lot of people want to know how to do. Now, the default way to do this, of course, is just to simply copy the object by going to Edit, Copy, Edit, Paste. And when you do that, it pastes it in somewhere arbitrarily on the artboard, and that can get quite tedious. So we really don't want to have to do that. So let's talk about different ways that we can actually duplicate this object. So the easiest way to duplicate an object is just to select it with the selection tool. And then holding down the Option key on the Mac, the Alt key on the PC, you can simply click and drag to duplicate the object. Once you have clicked and dragged to duplicate the object, you can then duplicate it again by holding down the Option or Alt key and dragging that one down. Now, right now, I'm just doing sort of a free-form duplication. But if I wanted to keep this in line with the previous copy that I've created, all I have to do while I'm holding down the Option or Alt key and dragging is to throw in the Shift key. The Shift key is going to constrain it. As you can see here, that little green line that follows me across, that's indicating that I'm snapping this object to the center point of the other object that I'm copying it from. When I release my mouse and release my Shift key and my Option key, everything falls into place. Now, that's the manual way of duplicating, but in many cases, you want to duplicate several versions of this image for patterns or whatever the case may be. So let me show you the quickest and easiest way to duplicate an object. Let's select this little basketball up here, and we'll create one copy by holding down the Option or Alt key, also the Shift key as we drag it. Don't hold down the Shift key before you drag it because it will not allow you to do anything. Let me show you what I mean by that. I'll undo that, Command or Control Z. If I hold down the Option key and then start to hold down the Shift key before I drag, see how the duplication arrowhead goes away? That means you're not going to be able to do anything. And see, as I click and drag, it doesn't do anything. So let's just do this right here. Let's hold down the Option or Alt key, click and drag. Then we'll hold down the Shift key to constrain it, and we'll drop it right there. Now, if I want to create a copy of this object right here using the same type of transformation that I just did, all I have to do is press the Command key on the Mac, the Control key on the PC, and the letter D. And that creates multiple copies all the way across. Then let's select all of these here, and let's hold down the Option or Alt key. Move this down. We can throw in the Shift key now to constrain it. And then let's press Command or Control D. And now we've got a whole artboard full of basketballs without us having to do several edit cuts, edit pastes, and all that crazy stuff. All we had to do was hold down the Shift key and the Option key and then use that little keyboard shortcut to duplicate all of our transformations. You can then make a selection of all of these and you can move them up just like that. Moving objects around the artboard is actually fairly easy. Just clicking and dragging, moving them wherever you want to go. As long as they're not locked, you will be able to move them anywhere that you see fit. And then duplicating them, as you can see, is actually pretty simple as well. So far you've seen me move and manipulate objects in many different ways, but we haven't actually talked about the specific act of scaling an object up or down. So in this movie I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and specifically I'm going to show you how to use the scale tool inside of Illustrator. So here I have a piece of artwork selected on my artboard, and I want to come over here and grab the scale tool, which you can see is located right here in the toolbar. You can also get to it by pressing the letter S. When you have the scale tool selected, you can, just like the other tools that we talk about, you can assign a reference point to the scale, and then as you start to draw up or down on that, it's going to scale it based on that reference point. So it's going to scale it up or down in relation to that point, which can be somewhat confusing. So traditionally, I don't use that portion of the tool all that much. I use the scale tool mostly for the ability to be able to scale my objects up or down by a specific factor or percentage. So for this particular object, let's put the reference point back into the center of this, and let's double-click the scale tool. When I double-click the scale tool, I've got this dialog box that comes up that allows me to do a uniform or non-uniform scale of the object. And so in this case, let's say that I needed this object to be 200% its normal size. I'll type in 200 and press the Tab key. When I press the Tab key, you will see that the object grows 200%, and it changes horizontal and vertical 200%. I have the option to scale rectangle corners, so if I had rounded the corners, they would scale proportionally with this. Also to scale strokes and effects, so if I had a stroke applied or an effect applied, it would look just as it did, bigger as it did when it was smaller. And then, of course, the preview checkbox. Turn that off, you see the original. Turn it back on, you see the new one. You can hit OK, and this scaling will be applied directly to the object that you started with. Or you can hit Copy. When you hit Copy, it is going to create a copy of that artwork, and the other one will be left behind it. So in this case, I could then start to use the duplicate by pressing Command or Control D, and it will actually create multiple copies of this artwork. Let me zoom in here. I'll show you. Let's grab the selection tool. So here's 1 copy, 2 copies, 3 copies of the original, all scaled up on that 200% factor. So if you need to do this type of transformation, using the scale tool is probably the easiest way to do it. You could also just select your object here and use the transform panel in order to do this. So you could come up here and you could actually just duplicate this by using 200% in that dialog box. But if you don't want to keep coming up to this, or you actually prefer the ability to get in and change all of those options, you can use whichever ones you prefer. You can also, if I undo this, you can just scale the object up or down by holding down the Shift key and clicking or dragging. This method requires you to pay very close attention to the width and height parameters that are being shown to you via the Smart Guide on the screen. So there are many ways that you can scale objects up or down. It's just a matter of which one you prefer and how much control you'd like to have. All right, so far we know how to move objects around, we know how to duplicate them, we know how to scale them up and down, but we really haven't talked a lot about rotating an object yet. So in this movie, I'm going to show you a couple of different ways that you can rotate your objects inside of Illustrator. So the first way to rotate your object is actually pretty simple. It's just to select the object on screen by clicking on it, and then to use the rotation handle that appears when you get to the corner point of the bounding box around it. So as you can see here, when I select the minute hand on this clock illustration here, I actually come to the corner and you can see this little arced arrow that appears. That means I can simply rotate this object around just like this. You can see I can rotate it around as much as I want. When I'm ready, I let it go. But the problem with that is it's anchored somewhere in the middle, so when I rotate it, it just rotates around itself, making it very hard for me to actually change the time on this particular clock. So I would have to use something like the rotate tool in order to change that, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So the easiest way, of course, is just to use the rotation handles around the object, but the more complex and more accurate way is to use the rotation tool, which is located here inside of the tools panel, and you can get there by pressing the letter R on your keyboard. You'll notice that when I select the rotation tool, you can see this little, almost looks like a little crosshair right here in the middle of the minute hand. And what I want to do before I start to rotate is just to click right here at this center point. You see when I hover over it, it says anchor point. And you may even see that it says center point at times if it crosses the center point of the circle that it overlaps. But in any case, what I'm going to do is just click right there, and that indicates that I'm going to rotate it around that particular point. Now I can come up here and I could change this to, let's say, be about 15 past the hour. Something like that. And then I can pan over. Let's do the same thing for this hand. Let's change this. So let's grab the selection tool, select this object, grab the rotation tool, put the reference point right there, and then let's just move this down until it's pointing down at the 6. So now we've got 6:15 as the time here. Now, in addition to that, you can also set the reference point to a completely different area or different shape if you wanted to. So let's say, for instance, that I wanted to create some little tick marks around the outside of this clock in order to represent the different times of day. So what I'll do here is I'll just grab my line segment tool, and I'll come up to the top, and I'm going to make sure I'm dead center when I do this, and I'm just going to make a mark, something like that. Now, by default, it is using a 6-point stroke. Right up here in the control panel, you see where it says 6 points? Just knock that down a little bit to like 3 points, something like that, and then hit the horizontal align center button so that it's right there, dead center. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create some copies of this and rotate it all at the same time. So let's grab the rotate tool, and let's take this. You see when I zoom in, the little reference point is right there in the center. I want you to go down here and find the center point of this circle and click right there. Now, I'm going to be rotating around that center point. So as I start to drag this over, do you see how it's going to rotate all the way around that? If you hold down the Shift key, it's actually going to snap to the different positions all around the clock. So let's do this. Let's hold down the Shift key. Let's get it right here to this first mark. Now, instead of letting go, hold down the Option key on the Mac, the Alt key on the PC, along with the Shift key, and then release your mouse and release your Shift key and your Option or Alt key. That is going to allow you to duplicate that. Now remember, earlier in this chapter, we learned how to duplicate transformations using Command or Control D. Well, do the same thing this time. Command or Control D all the way around this clock, giving me all of those different tick marks to indicate the different hours of the day, which is pretty simple. So Rotation doesn't have to be complicated. You just have to know how to use the tool and the right way to use the tool in order to make it work the way you want it to. Many people get frustrated by the rotation tools in Illustrator, but once you know how to move that reference point around, it's actually quite simple to get just about any result that you're looking for. In this movie, we're going to explore several different ways that you can sort of transform and distort your artwork. So far, we've been creating quote-unquote perfect shapes like squares and circles and triangles and stars and whatnot, but we want to maybe not have everything look so cookie-cutter. Well, that's where transformations and distortions come in. So let's go to the File menu, choose New, and just hit OK. Doesn't matter how big or how small the document is. And then what I want you to do is just go ahead and draw yourself a rectangle somewhere on screen. Once you have a rectangle drawn, come over here to the Tools panel, and I want to show you some of the tools that you can use in order to transform. You have the Free Transform tool, which allows you to come in here and actually modify this object, rotating it around, distorting the sides independently of one another, and so forth. You can also switch modes to the perspective distort so that you can sort of add perspective. And you can do a free distort, which will allow you to come in and just free range manipulate the corner points around. Now, the free transform tool has been revamped in the latest versions of Illustrator, and it's a lot better than it used to be. I love this little heads-up display that you get right here that allows you to go in between the modes. So the first one, of course, constrains you to only the original proportions of the document. Then you've got the free transform, perspective, and free distort, all of which allow you to transform what used to be a rectangle into whatever this happens to be now. Let's go ahead and delete that, and let's grab another object. In this case, let's do a polygon of some sort. We'll just do a hexagon out on screen. So in addition to the free transform tool, you also have inside of the scale toolbox something called the shear tool. And the shear tool allows you to assign the reference point, much the same as we've done a few times before. So let's click this bottom left-hand corner now. And with that selected, we can start to shear this away from that point or towards that point, or kind of manipulate it in those different ways to get some really interesting shapes. These tools, like the shear tool, can be somewhat hard to control, or at least they might seem that way at first, so you just have to move your mouse very deliberately, very slowly in order to make them do exactly what you want. But you'll find as you continue to use them that it does get somewhat easier to use, and that you'll start to predict exactly what types of transformations are going to happen based on where you put the reference point and how you click and drag either to or from that reference point as well. So as you can see, there are several ways that you can manipulate your artwork using these tools over here. And in addition to that, you also have the object menu where you can go in and you can transform through menus. So you could do things like reflect, scale, shear, and so forth. And all of those will open up a dialog box, like shear, for instance, will open this up. And so you can change things like the shear angle. You can make changes to that. You can change whether or not it goes horizontal or vertical. You can change the angle based on that. And then you get a preview before and after. And then you can always create copies. And those copies can create extra shapes on top of that. And then you could use that duplicate formula that I showed you before with Command or Control D to create some really interesting spirals and things like that. So this started off as just a regular old hexagon. Now we have this almost like layered piece of paper look here on screen. It's actually pretty cool what you're able to do with these very almost simple looking tools, but they really have some power underneath the hood once you know the secret to how to unlock it. We've already seen how to duplicate transformations by using the keyboard shortcut Command or Control D on your keyboard. But what I haven't shown you so far is a command called Transform Each, which allows you to transform each copy of an object as you go to create some really interesting looks. So in this example here, I have a triangle in the bottom left-hand corner, and this triangle is actually pretty special. This triangle has what's called a blending mode applied to it, which allows this triangle to interact with objects that overlap it in certain ways. So if you look over here in the panels, you'll see this little transparency panel, and this setting is set to multiply. By default, it's set to normal. But in this case, we're going to set it to multiply because it's going to allow overlapping copies of this triangle to sort of blend with each other in a very unique way. And multiply means that each time they overlap each other, it's going to look darker than the overlying color. So what we want to do is create almost like a really cool pattern, like a wispy pattern that goes across the bottom of this page. And in order to do that, we're going to use a command called transform each. So let's go to the object menu, choose transform, and go down to transform each. You can see that there's a keyboard shortcut associated with this. It's basically the entire left-hand side of your keyboard and the letter D. If you're really playing the home game here, it would be Shift Option Command on the Mac, Shift Alt Control on the PC, and the letter D. But I recommend just going up to the object menu and choosing transform and transform each. Once you do that, you're going to be taken into a dialog box that looks something like this, and by default, yours probably looks like this. So everything is set just as it was before. You've got the horizontal and vertical scaling set to 100%, the move set to 0, angle set to 0, and so forth. And your reference point is also probably right there in the center. By default, if we were to change the angle of this, for instance, to something like 10 degrees, you can see when we do that, that it's going to create this little rotation on this object, but we're rotating it around the center point. What I want to do is I want to rotate it around this top point right here. And we do that just by setting the reference point right there at the bottom. That way we're going to have it kind of swinging out and swinging over as we go along. So now I've got it set to 10 degrees. I've got this set to the top. It doesn't look like we're doing a whole lot from here, but if I hit copy, you notice that I get that new copy made right there on the artboard. And now I've got all of those different parameters set. I could have changed its scale. I could have changed its movement left or right. I could have changed the rotation angle. Everything is able to be changed from that dialog box. And now if I hold down the command key on the Mac, the control key on the PC, and just press the letter D, you can see now that it creates this really cool pattern that I can have going across my document. And that's not the only thing you can do with this. If I undo all of these here, and I'll just hold down the command key on the Mac, control key on PC, and the letter Z until I get back to the original. If I go to the object menu, choose transform, transform each, let's change some of these other options. So we're already rotating at an angle of 10 degrees. We've got this anchor point set to the top right here. Let's go ahead and move this thing. Let's do negative pixels. Let's do -5 pixels. And let's move it vertically, -5 pixels. And let's change the horizontal scale to 110. And let's change the vertical scale to 115. Now I'll hit copy again. Now we've got all of those parameters being copied. So if I hold down the command key, the control key on the PC, and press the letter D multiple times, it's going to create something that looks like that, which as I zoom out, and as you can see, is a pretty cool little pattern that I've created. And this is all based on a triangle and a blending mode. So these are the types of things that you have to sort of come up with inside your head to create complex pieces of artwork. You don't have to be a master of drawing. You just have to be a master of thinking and figuring out how to create things like this without really having to do a whole lot at all. All I did was open up a dialog box and hit a few buttons, and now I've got this really cool pattern that I could use on a desktop wallpaper, maybe the background for a slide deck, or I could even use this, as a design for a logo maybe. Potentially I'd have to do some reworking, but you get the idea of where I'm going with this. Using the transform each command is a great way to create really interesting things out of ordinary objects. So give it a spin and see what you can come up with. In this next movie, we're going to talk about reflecting objects. And the title might be a little misleading. You might not quite understand what reflecting means, because when we think reflecting, we think reflection, like we're looking in the mirror. So are we going to mirror something? Essentially, we are, but we're going to be doing it using sort of two-dimensional artwork and not 3 dimensions like you would see in normal space. So basically what I want to be able to do in this case is I want to recreate the other half of this guy and have it look like one complete illustration. Many people who work in Illustrator actually work on creating just half of what they need, and then they use the reflect tool in order to make the rest of the artwork sort of fall into place. So let's see exactly how this works. I'm going to make a selection just by clicking and dragging across all of this artwork. That way I get the entire guy selected. Then let's go over here into my tools panel. And in the tools panel, we want to come over and click and hold on the rotate tool and select the reflect tool, which you can also get by pressing the letter O on your keyboard. Once you have the reflect tool selected, it actually looks and functions much the same as the rotate tool does. In this case, I'm going to come up here to the top, and I'm just going to locate one of the anchor points at the top here, and I'm going to click to add the reference point. Once I have the reference point affixed to the top, it's very easy for me to reflect this object just by clicking and dragging. See how when I click and drag, the other half of his face just magically appears? And so if I hold down the Shift key, it allows me to snap it directly into place. And then I can release my mouse and release the Shift key. But you see here, now the other half of his face is missing. What did we do wrong? Well, if you remember correctly, earlier when we were talking about duplicating objects, the way to duplicate an object is to use the keyboard modifier of Option or Alt. So let's undo that change and let's redo it, this time using the Option or Alt key. So I'll put the reference point at the top, just like we did before. This time, click and start to drag out. Once I get it into position where I want it by holding down the Shift key, I'll hold down the Option key on the Mac, the Alt key on the PC. Then we will release our mouse and then release the keys on the keyboard. I can then take my selection tool and click away from it, and you can see exactly what we've done here. So we've been able to reflect this object to create the other half of this gentleman in this drawing, which looks pretty good. Now, really and truly, we might want to reselect all of that. So I'll just press Command or Control Z to undo, and then Shift Command or Shift Control Z to redo. That's going to easily let me select all of those objects together. Now, in order to make sure that we move them in unison, let's group them together as well. Command or Control G. And what I'm going to do is just use my keyboard arrow keys. So the left arrow key, just give it a little nudge. One tap to the left. That'll nudge it one pixel over. And then if I click to the outside, what we're basically trying to do is get rid of the seam here in the middle. And so we can kind of manipulate this until we get it just right. We want to make sure that we kind of get rid of that seam. And we could also change some of the colors and things like that to make that a little bit easier there. But for the most part, we've gotten rid of the seam. We can kind of see there. There we go. That looks a little better. And let's move back out. Click away. And there we go. So there's still going to be a little bit of a seam here in the middle, but that's okay. We could correct that simply by filling it in a little bit later. But for the most part, we've done a pretty decent job of reflecting this over and creating a completely different side of this gentleman here. And so you get the idea of what we're going for here. Basically, reflection is a way of duplicating while at the same time flipping the object to create a mirrored image of that object. You have to be very cognizant of where you put that reference point so that you can reflect it exactly like you want it. But for the most part, it's pretty easy to create an exact duplicate mirrored copy of an object just by using the Reflect tool. In addition to that, if I select this and remove it and zoom back in, you can also use a contextual menu to achieve this same result. So I could select this guy, right-click, and choose Transform, Reflect. When I select Reflect, it's going to open up this dialog box. I'll hit Preview so I can see exactly what it's doing. And so once I hit Preview, I'm going to see exactly what this looks like. It's going to create a mirrored copy, but it's going to create a mirrored copy in the exact same location as the other object was before. So in this case, if I wanted to create a copy, I hit the copy button instead of OK, and it creates that mirrored copy, and I then move it into place on my own, like so. And you can kind of nudge it into place, and there you go. There's your mirrored copy that way. Either way is perfectly fine. Most of the time, I prefer to use the Reflect tool, but if you're more comfortable just using a contextual menu, just right-click on your artwork, choose Transform, and select Reflect. Either way, you get an instant, mirrored, duplicated copy of your artwork.